This year, we've witnessed the most entertaining season I've ever seen with my own two eyes. Every single thing you look for in a sport, let alone hockey, has happened. Underdog stories.
Tippett spins, backhander, he scores! Oh, and Tippett absolutely dazzling! And that will do it. The Flyers have matched their longest win streak of the season.
Drama.
12-1 with a third consecutive loss on this road trip. They'll try to salvage something on Friday in the U.S. Cap. 16 wins in a row.
The NHL has sent a memo to its board of governors regarding speculation surrounding the Arizona Coyotes and a potential move to Salt Lake City.
The greatest scoring race we have witnessed since the days of Gretzky and Mario Lemieux.
But I think the coaches might have something to say. Great move by McKinnon, and he scores!
Poked free by Kane, and now McDavid. What a spin! The recovery, the shot, the score!
Kucherov trying to pull away. Nikita Kucherov up the middle, one-on-one with CC. Score!
Austin Matthews scoring at a rate we haven't seen in decades.
66 for Austin Matthews.
Oh, what's that? You want some physicality? This season has seen a big uptick in fights, line brawls, hell. Brady Tkachuk would have one of the greatest hitting games in NHL history, as he would finish with a goal in 16 hits. You heard that right, 16 hits.
Lisa's comes over and bang into the...
As this man had more hits than some NHL teams hit in an entire game. But most importantly, this season has shaped up to be a dramatic final finish. The Capitals and Penguins went from lottery teams to being on the verge of cementing a wild card spot. The Nashville Predators got lit up so bad at home, the Barrie Trotz would cancel their team event. And what do you know? They have now clinched the first wildcard spot. I mean, come on! The Vegas Golden Knights could technically get knocked out by the St. Louis Blues. Could you imagine? However, we have also witnessed glaring disappointment. Whether it was the Pinto Parlay, forfeiting a first-round pick due to a paperwork error, or sheer inconsistency, the Ottawa Senators have been a massive letdown. The Buffalo Sabres said screw it. We already set the record for the longest losing streak in NHL history, so let's top this record by becoming the Wayne Gretzky of not making the playoffs. Yet, one team to me has stuck out like a sore thumb, because after coming out of the gates hot, the Detroit Red Wings would fall into mediocrity, but by February, they would manage to scratch and claw their way into the playoffs. However, this momentum would be put to bed, as they would go on a 7-game losing streak.
Whatever group is here is not a happy bunch.
Which included letting in 15 goals in 3 games against the Sabres and Coyotes. Steve Yzerman is now in year 5 of his tenure with the Red Wings. So what in the hell is going on? You would think that this team would be ready for a playoff push, but they're not. And because of this, I've been constantly hearing the sentiment that Steve Yzerman is overrated or even a straight up fraud, as not only have they failed to make the playoffs, but under Yzerman, this team would have the worst season in NHL history. They haven't even made a single selection in the top 3. What is going on? Are the people right? Is the Yzer plan failing? What is wrong with this team? When the Canucks hired Jim Benning back in 2014, he would inherit a battered and bruised aging core, and this would have been okay if the Canucks had some blue chip prospects ready to make the jump. Except their previous GM, Mike Gillis, would trade away an astonishing amount of prospects and draft picks to push this team over the top. So he would inherit the worst prospect pool in the league. When Ken Holland was hired as GM of the Oilers, yes, he had one of the greatest players in NHL history to build around, but this team had glaring holes all throughout the lineup. Holes so big that they weren't being fixed anytime soon through trades or free agency. Let's even take a look at the Pittsburgh Penguins, because when Kyle Dubas took over this past season, not only does Pittsburgh have the oldest team in the NHL, but they have hands down one of the worst prospect pools I have ever seen. So whenever GM gets hired by a team, that GM takes over a completely unique situation. A team that 9 times out of 10 has some serious issues. And if we go back in NHL history, not even just the 3 aforementioned GMs I mentioned, all of their deep-rooted issues are stemmed from the draft. If you can't draft, there is zero chance that that team will sustain relevancy. Drafting and development is the foundation to every Stanley Cup winning team. Like seriously, think about the optics here. For the case of the Red Wings, from 2011 up until 2018, Ken Holland would select 64 players. And of those 64 players, how many do you think became stars? The answer is Dylan Larkin. One player from 64 draft picks turned into a star. Now, he would draft a couple key players like Mantha and Tyler Bertuzzi, but only drafting 3 top 6 players in an 8-year span meant that this Detroit team's recent failure was inevitable. But it gets even worse. Out of the 64 drafted players, only 9 of them would become regular NHL players. So a 14% chance that these players would go on to play 100, 200 games. And these 64 players have amassed a grand total of 2,334 points. Sounds impressive, right? Well, in that same time frame, Yzerman would make 59 picks for Tampa Bay, and those 59 picks would amass 1,701 points. Psych! Yzerman's 2011 draft class alone would amass over 1,700 points, as his 59 draft picks have amassed nearly 4,000 points. So over 1,600 more points with less draft picks and less first round picks. And this doesn't even take into account goalies, unless you are able to build an elite defensive core. With uncanny forward depth, a star goalie is mandatory for any cup run. And outside the draft, it has become nearly impossible to acquire a franchise goalie. Ken Holland, from 2011 up until 2018, would draft 6 goalies, and none of which would play a single game in the NHL. In that same time period, Steve Yzerman would draft Connor Ingram, who's currently leading the league in shutouts this season for the Coyotes. Not to mention a guy named Andrei Vasilevsky, one of the greatest goalies in NHL history. So if a GM has 1, 2, even 3 amazing drafts, you could still chop it up to luck, even if those picks develop into franchise players. Like seriously, based on our analysis and the horrible track record of Holland, you could make the assumption that him drafting Datsuk and Zetterberg was pure luck. Because at the time, Holland and his team were seen as geniuses. But if he and his scouts truly had that superpower to find talent, then how has he not replicated this in the last 25 years? At the end of the day, a lot of luck is involved in drafting, and this makes sense. In a lot of ways, a draft pick is like a lottery ticket. The higher the pick, the better the odds. And if that's your perspective, I get it. But for the case of Steve Yzerman, this man has drafted star after star after star. And we're not talking about a team winning a lottery and drafting McDavid. No, Yzerman has hands down the most complete drafting record outside the first round in NHL history. On this graphic, we have the greatest draft steals in NHL history. Pavel Datsuk, Bure, McGillney, Brett Hull, Zetterberg, Dougie Gilmour, Luc Robitaille, Theo Fleury, Mark Messier. These players were picked over a 30-40 year span, and we're not just talking about good players who were drafted in the later rounds. No, we are talking about some of the all-time greats, Hall of Famers, okay? Within a 4-year span, not 40 years, Steve Yzerman would pick 2 of the greatest draft steals in NHL history, which includes Nikita Kucherov, who at this point has claimed the title of the greatest draft steal in NHL history. He doesn't just have a 1, 2, 5-year track record. This man has been doing this for over a decade. And this right here is why I think the Red Wings are on the verge of something special. Now, I'm not saying that Yzerman has already found another Kucherov, but how in the hell can you look at his draft record and think it was a fluke? As I've also heard the idea that Yzerman isn't drafting his players. He just listens to his scouts. And this is true to some extent, but every GM has their specialty. Some are great at negotiating contracts. Some are hired to mainly run operations. Some are amazing pro scouts like the Vegas Golden Knights. But Yzerman's specialty has always been drafting, because keep in mind, Steve Yzerman personally scouts prospects with his team. Not only that, he's also a man who had one of the greatest careers in NHL history, as not only was he a top scorer in the league, a Stanley Cup winner, but he was also a Selke winner. He has an incredible ability to scout a player's game simply due to his extensive experience. So regardless of this year's outcome, since arriving to Detroit, Yzerman has had a clear vision: draft and and develop a championship roster. And even though this sounds great on paper from a rebuilding perspective, but this long-term vision has also led to people questioning Yzerman, if not calling him a fraud. Most fans want to see those tangible results, but tangible results and prospect development do not go hand in hand. Because Ken Holland left the prospect pantry bone dry, Yzerman has had to fill up the pipeline from the ground up. On this graphic, we have the Red Wings winning percentage from when Yzerman took over up until today. Not only has there been constant upward progression year after year, but Yzerman has doubled their point percentage, aka wins, from year 1 to 5. In that same time frame, the Red Wings went from having a minus 124 goal differential, as they would score just 167 goals in 2020, to scoring 274 this past season. So not only has their scoring increased by a tremendous amount, but this team has played much better defense with shaky goaltending, which honestly is impressive, as this doesn't even take into account that virtually all of the Red Wings' blue chip prospects are still developing in Europe or in the minors, as the Wings went from having the worst season from a non-expansion team in NHL history to nearly clinching a playoff spot in year 5. So just imagine how good this team will be if even just a couple of his draft picks turn into stars. Even if this team doesn't make the playoffs, you can't just turn a blind eye to the progression we've been seeing. If Ken Holland had drafted multiple franchise players in the final years of his tenure, this frustration and anger would be justified. But he didn't. Another sentiment I've been constantly hearing is that Steve Yzerman has made horrible signings in free agency, and from face value, I get the argument. Justin Hall, really? Yes, some of these contracts may seem outrageous on paper, but this doesn't take into account the importance of team culture. How in the hell will a young team with no playoff experience learn to compete at the highest level? Yes, adding veterans will inevitably push down players in the lineup, or even keep those players in the minors. But could you imagine a team of predominantly 20-year-olds? It would be a show. And you know what? We don't have to imagine. This right here is the Buffalo Sabres. If we look at the Sabres, in theory, this team should be a playoff lock. They have immense talent in every position, but at the same time, this team doesn't have a single Stanley Cup winning veteran, which without a doubt has played a role in them being a massive letdown. This is why teams pay a premium for past Stanley Cup winners. Their experience is invaluable, teaching a team how to play the right way. Like seriously, this is the sole reason why the Boston Bruins have been dominant for nearly 15 years. Yes, Yzerman has paid a lot for these veteran players, but the Red Wings are still in a great cap situation. They have nearly $30 million coming off the books. And with the rising salary cap, they'll be able to re-sign all their young stars with ease. And some of you may be wondering, why do I keep revisiting this topic? I am fascinated by roster construction and prospect development, and the Yzerman saga in Detroit has been the epitome of this. I'd appreciate ya if you left a like on this video, as it helps me out tremendously, and as always, thanks for watching.